Hello and a warm welcome back now today to talk about something that's quite interesting and is getting increasing, it's being increasingly observed and getting increasing traction here in biblical studies, in New Testament studies, and that is that Paul's letters also might be quite late. Now, I want to preface that with saying that I actually do believe, as well as some other scholars like Richard Carey and so on, that there is a core to Paul's epistles that actually probably predates 70 CE. And I would count Romans, Corinthians 1 and 2, and Galatians among those letters. Probably a few more as well. It's really hard to work out what's what because there is a clear literary development in those letters, interpolations into the letters, probably whole chapters stuffed into some of the letters as well. And I think what we're talking about here is the final form of those letters is certainly attested by about 150, with the 10-letter collection from Marcion, but those letters are not the final form, and there definitely appear to be things that are left out in small little snippets of information, like the brother of Jesus in Galatians is a good example of this, and also the three pastorals and other areas of sections, say, of Romans. And so on, Romans 16, I believe. But the final format there is certainly 2nd century and probably reasonably late 2nd century, when Irenaeus comes along and tells us all about the 14-letter collection, or 13-letter collection. They might all be post-70, but there are reasons to believe that with Paul's extremely minimal understanding of historical Christian, sort of the historical Jesus, I should say, no parables, no miracle works, none of the stories we find in John, no placing Jesus on earth really at all, apart from the most tiny references to like crucifixion and a rising again. Which doesn't have to be, as I've already pointed out, something that happened on earth. Then we get nothing really of any substance at all, and you're talking about a dying and rising celestial saviour, just in the guise and just in the likeness of so many other more pagan deities and so on. None of the family are mentioned of Jesus, for example. I mean, James is. But who knows the pillars really, what they're talking about. Mary, of course, isn't referenced. Now, what is interesting here is, and this might be a bit of a long video, hopefully not too long, is that there is already a class of literature in letter form that existed in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, and so on. And due to the quite self-evident evolution of the New Testament texts, and they're being taken up by the Greek and Roman world, it is certainly sane to suggest that this letter writing might be this kind of rhetorical letters, not really supposed to be for anyone particularly, just written as a letter to express a certain series of ideas or doctrines, concepts, and so on. Then this actually might be the gospel, the series of letters we find from Paul. So there are actually quite a few of these, and Nina Livesey, who wrote a book on this quite recently, and we can find quite a few talks with other people that she's had now on YouTube. I've probably been through about 5 hours of her discussions with people like Myth Vision podcast and Jacob Berman's History Valley. Really interesting. She has garnered a little bit of criticism, but I think her thesis largely makes sense. and that we might be seeing at some stage. Some of these letters might have been obviously true, reasonable, and genuine letters to certain churches, but all really conveying a celestial Messiah. But that certainly down the line these were used and then adapted, changed, epistles were added, and they became a kind of genre piece of rhetorical letter writing that the Greeks and the Romans were quite familiar with. So I'm just going to read some stuff here, and we're gonna see what's what really. I think it's quite important and interesting. It does make us more aware of what the epistolary works really, I think, looked like. Even James, Jude, and so on. They are quite well written, and they serve a purpose here. And she might be bang on the money here that they are actually works of kind of Greco-Roman literature, obviously written in Greek anyway. So we'll have a little look. Okay, in the ancient world, letters were not merely vehicles for private communication. They were often crafted as literary works, philosophical, rhetorical, and pedagogical compositions intended for public reading or moral instruction. The form of a letter lent such works an air of authenticity and intimacy, even when they were fictional or pseudonymous. This context provides an essential lens for understanding the Pauline epistles, which many of which exhibit the hallmarks of literary rather than spontaneous correspondence. Okay, scholars such as Stanley K. Stowers, Loveday Alexander, E. Randolph Richards, and John L. White have emphasized that the epistolary form in antiquity ranged from private notes to elaborate literary compositions. The Pauline corpus, when viewed in this light, shares strong affinities with the philosophical and moral letter traditions of Greece, Rome, and Hellenistic Judaism. So these cultures just straddled each other so nicely that this might well be a thesis we could uphold. Greek and Roman literary epistles. The Greek and Romans cultivated the letter as a rhetorical genre. These works imitated personal correspondences while functioning as public statements of philosophy, ethics, or political ideology. Plato's letters is one of these examples. 4th century BC were written in his name to defend his philosophical mission and respond to political crises, though many are widely regarded as synonymous compositions by later Platonists. That's really interesting. Epicurus's letters, 3rd century BC, preserved by Diogenes Laertius, condensed entire systems of philosophy into short letters addressed to disciples, models of concise didactic instruction. Isocrates and Demetrius used the letter for rhetorical form rhetorically to instruct, exhort, or rebuke political figures. Precisely the tone Paul often adopts towards his congregation. Seneca's letters to Lucius, 1st century CE. Pliny the Younger's letters. Some of these are preserved as public literary performances. Blended autobiography, rhetorical and moral reflection, and political commentary. They were carefully edited and circulated as a literary corpus. Really interesting. And Cicero's letters, 1st century BC now, again, to Atticus, Quintus, and others functioned as rhetorical self-portraits, using private exchanges to craft a political, philosophical, and philosophical and political identity. Lucian of Samosata's letters of the gods, 2nd century CE. The list goes on. I won't bore you with that. As Loveday Alexander notes, the preface of Luke's Gospel, 1993, this is when Alexander was writing, ancient readers would have recognized these as epistolary treatises, structured moral documents circulating within philosophical schools. The Pauline letters share these traits: literary polish, rhetorical structure, and theological argumentation. Boom. So the Jewish and early Hellenistic examples here. Letters of Aristides, the Epistle of Jeremiah, or Baruch 6, written as an admonition against idolatry, adopting the style of a personal warning to exiled Jews. Okay, 2 Maccabees 1-9, opening with an introductory letter that functions as a theological exhortation rather than genuine correspondence. Okay, so this was quite the thing to do if you were a good writer. The Pauline corpus is literary, epistolary composition. They're rhetorical in structure and didactic in purpose. Paul's letters display the classical rhetorical architecture of modern treatises. As Stoic shows, letter writing in Greco-Roman antiquity, 1986, Paul's epistles align with the category of parenthetical letters, moral exhortations modelled on philosophical correspondences. They're polished Greek rhetoric, logical progression, proem, body, exhortation, closing, and quotations of traditional material suggest careful composition, right? Big deal here, rather than spontaneous dictation. They're wonderful letters as well. Some of them are beautiful. Romans and Galatians are absolutely phenomenal piece of literature. Or the fiction of intimacy. The letters often create an illusion of intimacy here, of course, simultaneously addressing broad theological themes and quoting hymnic or creedal material. We know this very well. There's a lot of creedal statements there. Some of them are interpolations as well, let's be clear. Paul likely never wrote them, and they didn't appear in the earlier works from Marcion. So as they come in their final form, we now see the heavy hand here of a careful construction of these letters for the Orthodox Catholic churches. Pseudepigraphal and school production. Several letters attributed to Paul, Ephesians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, and 2nd Thessalonians, are widely regarded as pseudepigraphal, composed in Paul's name by disciples or later theologians. Okay. This practice aligns perfectly with the ancient literary convention of writing under a revered teacher's name, a mark of homage and continuity rather than deceit. So you can even see here why this guy was important. Paul would have been important to the early churches, but they wanted to distance themselves from this guy because he's basically a Gnostic, and create other works that help to politicize for the new church. You can see why in their final form this would make sense, that these were letters that were not meant for people but for congregations in a wider sense, a literary series of important propagandistic tools for the church. This practice aligns perfectly with the ancient literary convention of writing under a revered teacher's name, a mark of homage and continuity rather than deceit. The Pauline school thus resembles philosophical schools that preserved and extended their founders' doctrine through stylized letters. And we even go, I don't think I'll read the stylistic and thematic parallels with philosophical letters. There's a whole feature here, personal addresses, moral exhortations, use of exemplars, philosophical argumentation, all of these things, fictional intimacy, circular readership. All of these things line up with Seneca, Epicurus, Plato, Pliny. With Paul's works, they all present the same kind of important material import for the readers here, and the tools used. I'm going to leave that there. Obviously, so Nina Livesey's recent work here, probably very important. I suggest people go and read it. The book is called The Letters of Paul in their Roman literary context, reassessing apostolic authority. Nina E. Livesey provides perhaps the most comprehensive modern case that the Pauline corpus was a 2nd century Roman literary creation. Okay, her strongest arguments are a lack of external attestations for any of Paul's letters before the mid-2nd century. Crazy, right? And that's with Marcion. And it's only because later church fathers are talking about Marcion and telling us and pegging Marcion into history in Rome in about the 140s. Rhetorical and philosophical styles consistent with Roman Stoic and rhetorical schooling rather than spontaneous religious communication. The Marcionite connection, in which the first identifiable collection of Paul's letters appears within the Marcionite canon, implying the letters were composed or edited in that context. Internal literary indicators of fictionality, such as stylized salutations for formulaic self-presentation and inconsistent narrative timeline. Absence of a plausible historical or biographical stratum, meaning that Paul may have been a literary persona all along, constructed to provide apostolic authority to merge theological debates. Remember, we have a soul in the Old Testament. We have Paul's floating around close to Titus in the late 1st century, right? And this connection to the connection to Caesars and stuff that we see here. So it's actually, and the work of Acts, which is essentially wholly made up as far as most decent modern scholars are concerned. So we don't just have these letters, but we have a whole lot of other literature that's basically completely mythic in orientation. So I'm going to leave that there. I don't want to go on too long. I'm already 16 minutes in. So the implications, though, for early Christian literature: if the Pauline epistles are literary constructs, they present an early fusion of Greek rhetorical method with Jewish theological content. The Pauline corpus would thus be the first Christian school literature, establishing the genre that would shape later patristic correspondences, Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement. And this is so important because Ignatius, Polycarp, and Clement belong to a literary strata that is pre-canonical gospel. So these ideas and these writings feed into one another. Clement is a good example of a writer that knows Paul's basic Christology, but doesn't appear to have any clue about any of the historical story of Jesus. Go and check. Read Clement. Ignatius is the same. Polycarp, a very small letter. We know this already. Minimal on history. Like virtually nothing is known. But this could still mean that Paul's letters really came around and adapted and were fluid until about Irenaeus' time. When viewed through the lens here of Greco-Roman and Jewish literary traditions, they exhibit the structure, polish, and didactic aims of crafted literary composition, not spontaneous pastoral letters. All right, so I'm going to leave that there. I thought I had to do this because it is fairly new to Jesus' scholarship, but it's extremely important. I think that we understand that the letters, first and foremost, were not don't carry information with the Gospels attached to them. They appear to be minimal historical accounts in the extreme, and all of this could quite easily have been crafted in the 2nd century, in the early 2nd century certainly. We know 10 letters have been written by the 140s, and they are introduced by Marcion, but many of them are quite primitive. They represent early forms of these letters. They are not interpolated into. We know this through the church fathers, who conveniently leave out, when they're quoting Marcion's Apostolicon, they're leaving it out certain words and phrases and so on. Many of them, of course, are embellishments that would give us more of an historical account of Jesus, and they're left out of Marcion. So all stuff to think about. I bid you adieu.